need to improve that.
We're talking about shame with Dr. Paul Fitzgerald, who is an expert on shame. So carry on, Paul.
Thank you. Well, I was talking about how I got interested in shame, and part of my background, my family of origin, they a little bit more of the story. They moved from a rural southern state, Kentucky, to Indiana when I was 2 years old, and they really probably only went to maybe the third grade, so they had poor education. So they really felt different than the people they were living with, and they kind of put a lot of pressure on me to do well in school to kind of overcompensate for what now I realize their own sense of shame. In fact, a little funny story, they hated parent-teachers nights at school because they were so much older than my peers. They were like 40 and 50 when I was born. And we walked into Sunday school, we went to a class one time, a teacher, second grade I think it was, and the teacher looked up and she said, "Oh, Paul, I'm glad you brought your grandmother and grandfather tonight." Talk about embarrassing. And they never had to go back again because I learned that if you get good grades and never get in trouble, your parents don't have to come, and you make them happy and you make your teacher happy. And so I learned very quickly. When I was 7 years old, my sister, who was a teenager when I was born, died, and it was like my mother died. So I had this older mother and father, and when she died, my mother was very fragile, and I learned I can't be honest with my feelings, I can't grieve because it would put her over the top. Again, another shutdown. Long story short, I wound up doing theological work. I wound up working for a denomination, working my way up into the hierarchy, and I had a crash and burn from work addiction. I began reading literature about codependency and dysfunctional families, and my wife's a clinical social worker, so she had lots of books to put in my face and to read. And of course, she had everything figured out in her life. She was perfect, you know. But I began to realize that I didn't know anything about shame. It was not ever discussed theologically. I'd never heard a sermon about shame. But I knew we were very good at imposing shame. Religious groups are very, very controlling around shame issues. And so I wound up going to a seminar that my wife's employer was doing, and a man named Donald Nathanson came and was presented, and he was like a savant about shame. He had built his work on the research of a man named Sylvan Tompkins. Tompkins theorized that children are born with 7 or 8 innate affects. They're not really emotions yet because there's no history. The affect of anger, the affect of the smell when babies close their nose, or when they taste something that's bad, a bad taste, they spit it out. We don't teach those to kids. He's theorized that shame is an innate affect in humans. If you have a child and they are fascinated by an object and you take it away from them suddenly, you'll often see them go to anger, or they will go to a shame position where they turn down. A diminished sense of fascination, a diminished sense of interest, and it's almost universal. In some ways, I think that innate affect is what distinguishes humans in terms of drive to relationships and also community. Community boundaries are usually shame enforced. Interesting story from research. One of the first researchers about shame was, I just lost his name. My 76-year-old brain just lost his name. Anyway, he made this observation. He said animals don't blush. So that distinguishes animals from humans. that was used to justify slavery because you couldn't see a blush on a dark-skinned person. And that was used to justify that they're just animals. Horrible, horrible distortion of reality. So I had that crash and burn. I did some recovery work. In my ministry work with people, I started a 12-step group, not for alcoholics, but just for people who are struggling with life, kind of a generic 12-step group. And so that introduced me even to more shame issues. And then I wound up doing a doctoral work, and my research was around internalized shame. I did a correlation between internalized shame and degree of codependency and what's called spiritual well-being. Mm-hmm. The obvious correlation is that if you have a lot of internalized shame, you have a lot of codependency, and you have very little spirituality. And so instead of working on the codependency and improving that, what we did is we worked on the shame piece, and the codependency went down and the spirituality went up. So that was the essence of my dissertation. I came back in the area, Kansas City area where I was living, and worked for a counseling center. And they asked me to do a joint venture with another group in town that were doing experiential seminars. And I was interested. I was frustrated with my shame knowledge because I was able to talk to people about shame in a counseling setting, and they would go, well, okay, I connect those dots. But then I would see them a week later or a month later, and they were still stuck because information wasn't transforming anything. Mm-hmm. And so I went to this seminar, and they were doing a lot of experiential pieces, and I saw people dropping shame, but they weren't talking about it. It was off their radar. And I said to my wife, this is the clue here. We acquire shame experientially in relationship. And so some experiential piece and vulnerability is going to be important in healing it. Now I would say it's an unconscious process that's got to be processed unconsciously as opposed to just intellectually. And so we started a seminar, called it Breakthrough, did it for 25 years, helping people become aware of how shame was impacting their life.